For more than 2,500 years, a civilization has endured on the vast plateau between the deserts of Central Asia and the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. Empires have risen here. Empires have fallen. Yet the land we now call Iran has never vanished from history. Long before the modern world took shape, powerful kings ruled from stone palaces and sprawling capitals. They commanded armies that crossed mountains and deserts, and governed lands stretching from the Mediterranean to the edges of India. For a time, the Persian Empire became one of the largest powers the world had ever seen, but power invites challenge if foreign armies arrived. Some came as conquerors, others as liberators. Ancient cities burned. Dynasties collapsed. New rulers claimed the throne. Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, and Turks all passed through this land, each leaving their mark. Yet with every invasion, something older endured beneath the ruins. Persia adapted. It absorbed. It survived over centuries. The world around it changed. Ancient kings gave way to Islamic dynasties. Courts of poets and scholars replaced imperial war councils. Trade routes carried Persian culture across continents. Then, in the modern age, revolutions reshaped the state once again, transforming an ancient kingdom into the nation now known as Iran. Today, Iran stands at the center of global politics, its past echoing through every decision, every conflict, every alliance. But to understand the Iran of today, we must travel back to the moment when this story truly began, when a small kingdom on the Iranian plateau rose unexpectedly to challenge the great powers of the ancient world. A moment when a new empire was born, and when the long history of Persia first began to unfold. The middle of the 6th century before the Common Era was a time when power in the ancient world appeared settled. The great kingdoms that dominated the Near East had ruled for generations. Their armies were seasoned, their capitals were wealthy, their traditions seemed permanent, and yet history has a way of turning quietly. Around the year 550 BCE, in the rugged lands of the Iranian plateau, a new force began to gather. The region was not yet the center of a vast empire, it was a patchwork of tribes. Kingdoms and alliances spread across mountains, deserts, and wide valleys. The people who lived there spoke related languages and shared cultural traditions, but they were divided by geography and politics. Among them were the Persians. They were not the strongest people in the region, they were not the richest. For generations they had lived under the authority of a more powerful neighbor, the Median Empire, which dominated much of the Iranian plateau. During the early 6th century BCE, the Medes ruled. From the north, their kings commanded armies and tribute from smaller kingdoms, including the Persians. Power flowed through their court, and the Persians were expected to remain loyal subjects. But history rarely moves in straight lines. In the province of Persis, in the southwestern corner of the Iranian plateau, a young Persian ruler began to gather support among his people. His name would become one of the most remembered in ancient history, Cyrus. Later generations would call him Cyrus the Great, but at the time he was simply a regional king, one of many. Yet Cyrus possessed something rare in the politics of the ancient world, an ability to unite competing tribes and nobles under a single purpose, and that purpose was independence. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus led a revolt against the Median king, Astyages. The Medes were powerful, but their authority had begun to weaken. Noble families within their empire were divided. Some were willing to support the rising Persian leader if it meant reshaping the balance of power. The conflict that followed was not just a battle between two rulers, it was the turning point of an entire region. Cyrus defeated Astyages. With that victory, the Median Empire did not simply collapse, it was absorbed. The Persians inherited the administrative traditions, the alliances, and the territories of the Medes, but they also transformed them for the first time. A Persian-led state now controlled the heart of the Iranian plateau. It was the beginning of something far larger. What made Cyrus different from many conquerors was not only his military success, it was his method of rule. In the ancient world, conquest often meant destruction. Cities were burned, populations were enslaved, cultures were erased. Cyrus chose a different path. As his armies expanded westward and northward, he allowed conquered peoples to maintain many of their customs, religions, and local institutions. Instead of replacing entire societies, he incorporated them into a growing imperial system. This decision was not simply generosity, it was strategy. The lands Cyrus conquered were vast and culturally diverse. Attempting to erase local traditions would have required endless war. Allowing communities to retain their identities, while recognizing Persian authority, created stability across regions that might otherwise have resisted occupation. Power in this empire became practical by the time Cyrus turned his attention westward toward Lydia, one of the wealthiest kingdoms of Anatolia. The foundation of Persian expansion was already secure. The Lydian king, Croesus, was famous throughout the ancient world for his wealth. His kingdom controlled trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world with the interior of Asia. Gold from Lydia filled royal treasuries, but wealth can attract danger. In 546 BCE, Cyrus defeated Croesus and captured the Lydian capital of Sardis. With this victory, Persian power reached the shores of the Aegean Sea. The empire now touched the Greek world, but Cyrus was not finished. His next campaign would become one of the most significant in the history of the ancient Near East. To the south lay the ancient kingdom of Babylon, one of the oldest and most respected centers of civilization. Babylon was not merely a city, it was a symbol of political and cultural authority that stretched back centuries. In 539 BCE, Cyrus marched toward Babylon. What followed would reshape the political map of the region. The Persian army entered the city with relatively little destruction. Babylon fell into Persian hands, and with it came control of Mesopotamia, the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that had supported civilizations for thousands of years. For many people living under Babylonian rule, Cyrus presented himself not as a destroyer but as a restorer of order. One of the most famous artifacts from this moment is the Cyrus cylinder, an inscription that describes how Cyrus allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. Among those who benefited from this policy were Jewish communities who had been exiled to Babylon decades earlier. In practical terms, this approach strengthened loyalty to the new Persian ruler. By the time of Cyrus's death in 530 BCE, the empire he had created stretched across an enormous territory, from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. It was already one of the largest political systems the ancient world had ever seen, but it was also fragile. Large empires often collapse quickly after the death of their founders. Rival factions compete for power. Regional leaders test the limits of central authority. Without strong leadership, unity can dissolve. For several years after Cyrus's death, the Persian Empire experienced uncertainty. His son Cambyses II continued expansion by conquering Egypt in 525 BCE, bringing another ancient civilization under Persian rule. Yet after Cambyses died unexpectedly in 522 BCE, chaos followed. Multiple claimants attempted to seize the throne. Revolts erupted in different regions of the empire. Provinces declared independence. For a brief moment, the massive state created by Cyrus seemed ready to fracture. Out of that crisis emerged another figure who would shape Persian history, Darius I, later known as Darius the Great. Darius did not inherit a stable empire, he had to rebuild one. During the early years of his reign, beginning in 522 BC, Darius spent much of his time suppressing rebellions across the empire. From Mesopotamia to Central Asia, rival leaders attempted to break away from Persian control. One by one, Darius defeated them. These campaigns were not simply military operations, they were demonstrations that the imperial system created by Cyrus could survive the death of its founder. But Darius understood something deeper. Conquest alone could not sustain an empire of such scale. Stability required organization, and so Darius began one of the most ambitious administrative transformations in ancient history. The empire was divided into provinces known as satrapies. Each satrapy was governed by an official called a satrap, who collected taxes, maintained order, and represented royal authority. In the region, this system allowed the central government to oversee distant territories without attempting to control every local decision. But Darius did not rely solely on provincial governors to prevent satraps from becoming too powerful. The empire developed layers of oversight. Royal inspectors traveled throughout the provinces, reporting directly to the king. Military commanders were often separate from civil administrators. Local traditions were respected, but loyalty to the empire was constantly monitored. It was a system designed to balance autonomy with control. The infrastructure supporting this system was equally remarkable. Darius ordered the construction and maintenance of extensive road networks that connected major cities across the empire. The most famous of these routes, often called the Royal Road, stretched for thousands of kilometers, linking the Aegean coast with the Persian heartland. Along these roads, relay stations allowed royal messengers to travel with astonishing speed. For the time, communication became the lifeline of imperial authority. Taxes collected from across the empire funded large building projects, including the magnificent ceremonial capital of Persepolis, where representatives from dozens of subject peoples brought tribute to the Persian court. The visual message was unmistakable: many nations, one empire. Yet as Persian influence expanded westward, tensions grew along the frontier with the Greek city-states of the Aegean world. The Greeks were not a unified nation, they were independent cities: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and others, each with its own political system and rivalries, but they shared cultural traditions and language, and they valued independence fiercely. Persian rule had already reached the Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor in 499 BCE. These cities revolted against Persian authority in what became known as the Ionian Revolt. Some mainland Greek cities, including Athens, sent limited support to the rebels. From the Persian perspective, This intervention could not go unanswered. The revolt was eventually crushed, but Darius now turned his attention westward. He intended to punish the cities that had interfered in Persian affairs and to extend imperial authority deeper into the Greek world. This decision set the stage for one of the most famous confrontations in ancient history, the Greco-Persian Wars in 490 BCE. A Persian expeditionary force landed near the plain of Marathon, northeast of Athens. The Persian army was experienced and well equipped, but the Athenians, fighting close to home, mounted a determined defense. The battle ended in a surprising Greek victory for the Persians. This defeat was not catastrophic. The empire remained vast and powerful, but it demonstrated that expansion into Greece would not be simple. Darius began preparations for a larger campaign. He did not live to see it. After his death in 486 BCE, the task passed to his son Xerxes I. Xerxes inherited both the empire and the unfinished conflict with Greece. Determined to succeed where his father had failed, he assembled one of the largest invasion forces the ancient world had ever seen. In 480 BCE, Persian armies crossed into Greece. What followed became a series of battles that later generations would remember as defining moments of resistance. Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. At Thermopylae, a small Greek force attempted to block the Persian advance through a narrow mountain pass. They were eventually defeated, but their stand became legendary. At Salamis, the Greek fleet achieved a decisive victory against the larger Persian navy. By 479 BCE, Persian forces withdrew from mainland Greece after the Battle of Plataea. The empire had not collapsed. Its territories remained immense, but the dream of fully incorporating the Greek mainland into the Persian system faded. From that point forward, Persian kings focused largely on maintaining stability within their vast domains rather than pursuing further western conquest, and maintaining stability was no small task. Empires of this scale require constant negotiation between power and tolerance. Roads must be maintained, taxes collected, rebellions suppressed, alliances preserved. For nearly 2 centuries after the reign of Darius and Xerxes, the Achaemenid Empire continued to function as one of the largest and most sophisticated political systems in the ancient world. But no empire lasts forever. In the 4th century BCE, a new power began to rise far to the west. In the kingdom of Macedon, its young king, Alexander, had grown up hearing stories of the Persian Empire and the wars fought by his Greek predecessors. By 334 BCE, Alexander launched an invasion of Persian territory. Within a decade, the empire that had once stretched across 3 continents collapsed under the pressure of relentless military campaigns. In 330 BCE, the last Achaemenid ruler was defeated. The Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, came to an end. Yet something remarkable happened. Even as political control shifted to foreign rulers, the administrative traditions, cultural networks, and geographic logic of the Persian imperial system did not disappear. The idea of governing vast territories through tolerance, infrastructure, and layered administration had already reshaped the ancient world, and those ideas would survive long after the empire itself had fallen. What had begun in 550 BCE as a rebellion on the Iranian plateau had transformed global history. But the story of Iran did not end with the fall of the Achaemenids. Far from it, because in the centuries that followed, new empires would rise on the same land. New religions would reshape society. New invasions would test the endurance of Persian civilization once again, and each transformation would leave marks that could never be erased. The balance created by the first Persian kings had been broken. The next chapter would reveal what replaced it. By the late 4th century BCE, the Persian Empire had already ruled vast lands for nearly 200 years. What had begun in 550 BCE with the rise of Cyrus the Great had grown into one of the most expansive and organized political systems the ancient world had ever known. Its authority stretched across deserts and mountains, from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, from the steppes of Central Asia to the fertile valleys of Egypt. It was an empire built not only on conquest, but on administration, roads, tribute, and careful tolerance of many cultures for generations. The system had held, but by the time the 4th century BCE arrived, something had begun to change. The empire was still vast, its cities were wealthy, its kings still ruled from magnificent courts, yet beneath the surface, the machinery that held the empire together had begun to slow. Rivalries among noble families weakened unity. Satraps, provincial governors who once served the throne faithfully, sometimes ruled their territories like independent princes. The structure remained powerful, but it had grown heavy. Empires often face this moment after long success. Stability creates complexity. Complexity creates distance between rulers and the realities of distant provinces. Communication becomes slower, decisions become cautious, and somewhere beyond the borders, a younger power begins to rise. Far to the west, in the rugged lands of Macedon, a small kingdom had begun to transform under the leadership of King Philip II. Macedon had long stood on the edge of the Greek world, partly Greek, partly separate, often dismissed by the proud city-states of southern Greece. But Philip saw opportunity where others saw weakness. He reorganized his army, developing a disciplined infantry formation known as the phalanx. Armed with long spears that could hold enemy forces at distance, he strengthened cavalry units that could strike quickly across open terrain step by step. He united the often divided Greek city-states under Macedonian influence by 338 BC. After defeating a coalition of Greek forces at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip had effectively become the dominant power in Greece. His ambitions did not stop there. Philip planned a massive campaign eastward, an invasion of the Persian Empire itself. For the Greeks, this war carried deep symbolic meaning. Memories of the Greco-Persian Wars, fought generations earlier in the 5th century BCE, still shaped Greek identity, but Philip never led that invasion. In 336 BCE, he was assassinated. The throne passed to his young son. His name was Alexander at the time. Alexander was only 20 years old. Many assumed the fragile Macedonian coalition would collapse without Philip's leadership. Greek cities quickly considered rebellion. Rival claimants to power appeared, but Alexander moved with remarkable speed. Within a year, he crushed revolts in Greece and reasserted Macedonian authority. Then he turned eastward, toward the greatest empire the world had ever seen, the Persian Empire. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow straits separating Europe from Asia. His army was not enormous by Persian standards. Estimates suggest roughly 40,000 soldiers, but they were highly trained, disciplined, and deeply loyal to their young king. More importantly, Alexander carried with him a strategy shaped by both ambition and necessity. He could not defeat the Persian Empire through slow expansion. The empire's size would overwhelm him over time. Instead, he needed decisive victories that would collapse the Persian command structure itself. His plan was simple: defeat the Persian king and the empire would unravel. The first major confrontation came at the Battle of the Granicus River in 334 BCE. Persian forces attempted to block Alexander's advance in western Anatolia. The battle was fierce, but the Macedonian army pushed through the defenses. With that victory, the gates of Asia Minor began to open. Cities that had once belonged to the Persian Empire now faced a choice: resist or submit. Many chose submission, calculating that Persian protection had become uncertain. The campaign moved forward. In 333 BCE, Alexander encountered the Persian king Darius III near the town of Issus, along the eastern Mediterranean coast. This was no longer a provincial battle, it was a direct confrontation between kings. Darius commanded a large army drawn from many parts of the empire. In theory, Persian numbers should have overwhelmed the Macedonians, but the terrain near Issus narrowed the battlefield, preventing the Persian forces from using their full strength. Alexander exploited the moment, leading a cavalry charge at the center of the Persian line. He drove directly toward Darius himself. The attack created panic among the royal guard. As the battle turned chaotic, Darius fled the field. In ancient warfare, the flight of a king carried enormous consequences. Armies often interpreted it as the collapse of divine favor. Without the king present, coordination failed. Persian forces retreated. The victory at Issus in 333 BCE changed the course of the war. It proved that the Persian king could be defeated. But Alexander did not immediately pursue Darius into the Persian heartland. Instead, he moved south along the Mediterranean coast. Control of coastal cities would weaken the Persian navy and secure supply routes for the Macedonian army. The campaign included one of the most difficult sieges of the ancient world. The city of Tyre. Tyre stood on an island fortress protected by high walls and powerful fleets. For months, the city resisted Alexander's forces. Eventually, the Macedonians constructed a massive causeway across the water, allowing siege towers and battering rams to reach the walls. In 332 BCE, Tyre fell. The destruction was severe. Thousands were killed or enslaved. The message was unmistakable: resistance would carry terrible cost. From Tyre, Alexander continued south into Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. Egyptian priests recognized him as a pharaoh in the Nile Delta. He founded a new city that would bear his name, Alexandria. Yet the decisive confrontation still lay ahead. Darius III had not abandoned the war. He gathered a new army deep within the empire and prepared to face Alexander again. The final and decisive battle occurred near Gaugamela in 331 BCE, on a vast plain chosen specifically to allow the Persian army to deploy its full strength. Darius had learned from Issus he intended to overwhelm the Macedonians through numbers and maneuver, but Alexander once again relied on speed and precision. During the battle, he created a gap in the Persian formation and drove directly toward the royal position. Once again, Darius fled. Once again, the Persian army collapsed. After Gaugamela in 331 BC, the path into the Persian heartland lay open. Alexander marched toward the empire's great capitals. One by one, they fell. Babylon surrendered peacefully. Susa followed soon after, but the most symbolic conquest was yet to come. In 330 BC, Alexander's forces reached Persepolis, the ceremonial capital built by the kings of the Achaemenid Empire. Persepolis was not merely a city, it was the physical representation of Persian imperial power. Its terraces, columns, and palaces had been constructed by generations of kings, Cyrus's successors who believed their empire would endure forever. The city had welcomed delegations from dozens of subject nations. It had stored immense wealth gathered through centuries of tribute. Now it belonged to Alexander. What happened next remains one of the most debated moments of the ancient world. Sometime after occupying the city, Persepolis was set on fire. The flames spread through the royal palaces, consuming wooden roofs and decorations that had once symbolized imperial glory. Ancient sources offered different explanations. Some claim the fire was deliberate revenge for the Persian destruction of Greek temples during earlier wars. Others suggest it began during a drunken celebration among Alexander's companions. The exact cause remains uncertain, but the result was unmistakable. The ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire burned. The destruction of Persepolis in 330 BCE carried enormous symbolic weight. Even if the empire had already collapsed politically, the burning of its ceremonial capital signaled the end of an era. 2 centuries of Achaemenid rule had come to an end, yet the story did not stop there. Alexander had conquered the empire, but conquering land is not the same as governing it. The territories he now controlled stretched across 3 continents. Their populations spoke different languages and followed different traditions. Maintaining such a vast domain required new solutions. Alexander began experimenting with a hybrid system that blended Macedonian military authority with Persian administrative traditions. He retained many local officials and adopted aspects of Persian royal ceremony. Some of his Macedonian followers resisted these changes. They believed the conquerors should remain culturally distinct from the conquered, but Alexander seemed to envision something broader, a new imperial order. Yet this vision had little time to mature. In 323 BCE, while in Babylon, Alexander died suddenly at the age of 32. His death created a crisis that would reshape the political landscape of the entire region. Alexander had not left a clear adult heir capable of ruling his enormous empire. His generals, known later as the Diadochi, or successors, quickly began competing for control. The empire fractured within a few years. Rival commanders carved the territories into separate kingdoms. One of these generals, Seleucus I, eventually gained control over much of the former Persian lands stretching from Mesopotamia through Iran and into parts of Central Asia. By 312 BC, the foundation of the Seleucid Empire had emerged. This marked the beginning of a new historical period known as the Hellenistic Age. The word Hellenistic comes from Hellas, the Greek name for their own civilization. During this era, Greek culture spread across many regions once ruled by Persia. Cities were rebuilt or newly founded following Greek urban models. Greek language became common in administration and trade. Greek philosophy, art, and architecture influenced local traditions, but this transformation was not simply cultural replacement. In many places, local Persian traditions continued beneath the surface. Administrators, merchants, and communities adapted to the new political environment while preserving older customs. Power had changed hands, but civilization rarely disappears overnight. The Seleucid rulers faced a challenge similar to the one earlier Persian kings had confronted. Their empire was enormous and diverse. Maintaining loyalty across distant territories required constant negotiation between central authority and local autonomy. Over time, the Seleucid state struggled to maintain control over its eastern provinces. Distance weakened their grip. Local leaders gained influence. New political forces began to emerge. By 247 BCE, one of these forces would break away to form a new Iranian-based power, the Parthian kingdom. This moment marked the beginning of another chapter in the long story of Iran. The Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus, had fallen. Its capital had burned. Greek rulers now governed much of the region, but beneath the surface, the traditions of the Iranian plateau had not vanished. They had only adapted, and soon they would return to power in ways that would reshape the region once again. The age of Alexander had shattered the old imperial order, but the land of Persia had not finished shaping history. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire in 330 BCE had shattered a political system that once governed much of the known world. The flames that consumed Persepolis marked more than the destruction of a ceremonial capital. They marked the collapse of an order that had lasted nearly 2 centuries. In its place came something new. The generals of Alexander the Great divided his empire after his death in 323 BCE, creating competing kingdoms across the lands he had conquered. Among these new states, the Seleucid Empire controlled much of the former Persian territory, from the Mediterranean to the distant eastern provinces of the Iranian plateau. At first, the Seleucid rulers believed they could simply inherit the machinery of the old empire. They preserved many administrative structures. They kept local officials in place. Greek cities were founded across the region, spreading the language and customs of the Hellenistic world. But there was a problem that no decree could solve. The lands of Iran were too far Away distance has always shaped the fate of empires. The Iranian plateau is vast and rugged, divided by mountain chains, deserts, and scattered fertile valleys. To govern it effectively requires constant attention from the center of power. The Seleucid kings ruled primarily from the western parts of their empire, Syria and Mesopotamia. Their attention focused on Mediterranean politics, on wars with rival Hellenistic kingdoms such as Egypt's Ptolemaic dynasty. The eastern provinces became distant frontiers. Governors in these regions often acted independently. Local tribes maintained their traditions. Trade caravans moved across the plateau much as they had for centuries, largely beyond the reach of centralized control. Over time, the grip of the Seleucid rulers weakened. By the 3rd century BCE, this weakness became an opportunity. On the northeastern frontier of the Iranian plateau, beyond the Great Deserts and near the edges of Central Asia, lived a group of Iranian-speaking nomadic tribes known as the Parnai. They were not urban rulers or administrators, they were horsemen. Their lives were shaped by the open steppe, vast grasslands where survival depended on mobility, discipline, and mastery of the horse. Their political structures were simpler than those of the great imperial courts. Leadership was based on loyalty, kinship, and strength. Among these tribes rose a leader whose name would mark the beginning of a new era. His name was Arsaces. Around 247 BCE, Arsaces led his followers southward into the region known as Parthia, a territory that had once been a province of the Achaemenid Empire and was now loosely governed by the Seleucids. The Seleucid authority there was thin. The governor was isolated. Reinforcements were distant. Arsaces seized the moment. He overthrew the local administration and declared independence. This was not yet the birth of a vast empire at first. It was a small kingdom carved from the edges of a declining Hellenistic state. But history often begins quietly. The region Arsaces captured was strategically important. Parthia lay along the routes connecting Central Asia to the Iranian plateau and the Western world. Caravans carrying silk, spices, precious stones, and metals passed through its territory. Control of these routes meant wealth, and wealth meant the ability to build power. The kingdom founded by Arsaces gradually expanded under his successors, who became known collectively as the Arsacid dynasty. Unlike the centralized monarchy of the old Persian Empire, Parthian rule was more flexible and decentralized. Local nobles retained significant autonomy. Regional leaders commanded their own forces and managed their own lands, provided they recognized the authority of the Parthian king. This system reflected the realities of the plateau. Trying to rule every valley and tribe from a distant capital would have been impossible. Instead, the Parthians built alliances with local elites who shared an interest in resisting outside control. It was a system built on negotiation rather than rigid bureaucracy. At the same time, the Seleucid Empire continued to weaken. Internal conflicts, wars in the west, and the sheer difficulty of maintaining control across vast territories gradually eroded their authority. By the 2nd century BC, the Parthians had moved beyond survival. They began to expand under the leadership of Mithridates I, who ruled from approximately 171 BCE to 132 BCE. The Parthian kingdom transformed into a major imperial power. Mithridates captured large sections of Iran, then moved westward into Mesopotamia, taking control of cities that had once been centers of Seleucid rule. One of the most important of these cities was Seleucia on the Tigris, a major commercial hub. With this conquest, the Parthians secured control of the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The economic heart of the region now lay within their grasp. The Seleucid Empire, once a dominant successor to Alexander, began to shrink rapidly. By the late 2nd century BCE, the Parthians had effectively replaced the Seleucids as the dominant power across much of the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia. But expansion created new challenges to the west. A rising power was beginning to dominate the Mediterranean world. Rome. In the early centuries of the Roman Republic, Roman influence had been largely confined to Italy, but by the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, Rome had conquered Greece, defeated Carthage, and extended its reach across the eastern Mediterranean. Eventually, Roman influence pushed into the lands that had once belonged to the Seleucids, and where Roman power advanced, it eventually met the Parthians. This meeting was inevitable. Both powers controlled wealthy territories. Both relied on expanding influence to maintain prestige and stability, and between them lay the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, a region too valuable to ignore. The first major confrontation occurred in 53 BCE. A Roman general named Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the most powerful men in the Roman Republic, led a campaign eastward with the goal of conquering Parthian territory. He believed the Parthian kingdom would collapse under the weight of Roman military discipline, but Crassus misunderstood his opponent. The Roman army was designed for close combat, heavy infantry formations advancing steadily across open ground. Parthian forces fought differently. They were masters of cavalry warfare. Their armies relied heavily on mounted archers, riders who could move rapidly across the battlefield while firing arrows with deadly accuracy. They also fielded heavily armored cavalry known as cataphracts, capable of delivering devastating charges when the Roman army advanced into the deserts of Mesopotamia. They encountered Parthian forces near the town of Carrhae. The battle that followed became one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman military history. Parthian horse archers surrounded the Roman legions, raining arrows from a distance. Roman soldiers struggled to respond effectively. The open terrain favored the mobility of the Parthian cavalry. Crassus's army collapsed. Crassus himself was killed. The Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE sent shockwaves across the Roman world. It proved that Rome, the most powerful military force in the Mediterranean, could be defeated. For the Parthians, the victory secured their reputation as a formidable rival. From that moment forward, the lands between Rome and Parthia became a contested frontier. Cities changed hands. Armies marched east and west. Diplomacy and warfare alternated across generations. Neither empire could destroy the other completely. Geography made total conquest nearly impossible. The Roman system was strongest in the Mediterranean world, where roads, supply lines, and naval power allowed legions to move efficiently. The Parthians were strongest across the Iranian plateau and Central Asian frontier, where cavalry warfare and flexible alliances suited the terrain. The result was a long, unstable balance. Yet beyond warfare, the Parthian Empire achieved something equally significant. It controlled the crossroads of Eurasian trade. Across the deserts and mountain passes of Central Asia ran a network of caravan routes that later historians would call the Silk Road. These routes connected the distant civilizations of China, India, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. Silk, spices, precious metals, glassware, and textiles moved along these routes. The Parthians stood in the middle. They did not necessarily produce many of the goods being traded, but they controlled the territory through which the goods traveled. By taxing caravans and facilitating trade, the Parthian rulers became wealthy intermediaries between east and west. Merchants from distant lands passed through Parthian cities. Ideas, religions, and technologies traveled alongside silk and silver. This role transformed the Iranian plateau into a bridge between civilizations. But prosperity also carried risks. The decentralized nature of Parthian rule, which had once been a strength, sometimes created instability. Powerful noble families competed for influence. Regional governors occasionally challenged royal authority. Unlike the tightly organized bureaucracy of the earlier Achaemenid Empire, the Parthian system depended heavily on personal alliances. When those alliances held, the empire functioned well. When they weakened, internal conflict followed. Over the centuries, Rome and Parthia continued their uneasy rivalry. Major campaigns occurred in 36 BCE, 114 to 117 CE, and several other periods, each reshaping the frontier but rarely producing lasting dominance. Cities such as Ctesiphon, near modern-day Baghdad, became major Parthian capitals and centers of power. Yet by the 3rd century CE, cracks had begun to appear in the Parthian system. Internal divisions among noble families intensified. Regional leaders became increasingly independent. Central authority weakened. At the same time, a new force was rising in the southern parts of the Iranian plateau. This force would claim to restore the ancient glory of Persia itself. In 224 CE, a ruler named Ardashir I would defeat the last Parthian king and establish a new empire, the Sasanian Empire. With that victory, nearly 5 centuries of Parthian rule would come to an end. But the Parthians had already reshaped the course of history. They had revived Iranian political power after the collapse of the Achaemenids. They had resisted Rome. For centuries they had transformed the Iranian plateau into the center of global trade networks linking east and west. The world they created was not the same as the one Cyrus the Great had ruled. It was looser, more flexible, sometimes unstable, but it ensured that the Iranian world remained a major force in Eurasian history. And the struggles between east and west that began during the Parthian age would echo for centuries to come, because the empire that replaced them, the Sasanian state, would push that rivalry with Rome to its most intense and dramatic form. Yet the balance along the frontier was about to break again, and the consequences would reshape the region once more. The early 3rd century of the Common Era was a moment of deep instability across the Iranian plateau. For nearly 5 centuries, the Parthian Empire had ruled these lands through a system built on alliances among powerful noble families. That system had once allowed the empire to expand, to resist Rome, and to control the great caravan routes linking east and west. But by the 3rd century CE, the same flexibility that had once been a strength had become a weakness. Regional lords commanded their own armies. Noble houses competed for influence. Kings rose and fell through complicated struggles among aristocratic factions. The central authority of the Parthian monarch was often limited, forced to negotiate constantly with powerful provincial elites. The empire still existed, its cities still thrived, trade still flowed across the plateau, but the structure holding everything together had grown fragile in many ways. The Parthian state had become a loose federation rather than a unified empire. That arrangement might have endured longer if the external world had remained stable, but it did not. The West, The Roman Empire, which had long contested the frontiers of Mesopotamia, was undergoing its own transformations. Roman power shifted and restructured as new emperors sought greater control over distant provinces. Military pressure along the frontier never fully disappeared within Iran itself. Many began to look back to an earlier age. They remembered the time before the Parthians. They remembered the Achaemenid kings Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, who had once ruled a highly organized empire stretching across 3 continents. That earlier system had been centralized. Its authority had been clear. Its kings had claimed not merely political power but sacred legitimacy. For some leaders within the Iranian world, the Parthian model now seemed inadequate, and in the southern province of Persis, the homeland of the ancient Achaemenids, a new movement began to take shape. This region had always held symbolic importance. Even after the destruction of Persepolis in 330 BCE, the memory of Persia's earlier imperial greatness remained strong among local elites and religious authorities. Within Persis lived a local ruler named Ardashir, the son of a regional governor named Papak. Ardashir was not initially the leader of a vast army or a revolutionary movement, but he possessed ambition, and he understood the weakness of the Parthian system. He began by consolidating power within his own region. Local rivals were defeated. Nearby territories were brought under his authority. Gradually, Ardashir transformed himself from a provincial leader into a rising challenger to Parthian rule. The Parthian king at the time, Artabanus IV, recognized the threat. Conflict became inevitable. The decisive confrontation came in 224 CE, when the armies of Ardashir and Artabanus met in battle. The Parthian forces, though experienced, no longer commanded the unified loyalty they once had. Ardashir's movement carried a powerful message. The restoration of strong Persian kingship. Artabanus was defeated and killed. With that victory in 224 CE, the Parthian Empire came to an end. In its place rose a new dynasty, the Sasanian Empire. The Sasanians claimed legitimacy not only through military success but through cultural and religious revival. Ardashir presented himself as the restorer of ancient Persian authority, linking his rule symbolically to the earlier Achaemenid tradition. But the new empire would not simply copy the past, it would transform it from the beginning. The Sasanian state pursued a far more centralized structure than the Parthian system. It replaced royal authority was strengthened. The king, now often referred to as the King of Kings, stood at the center of a carefully organized political hierarchy. The noble families did not disappear, but their independence was reduced. The monarchy demanded greater loyalty. Religion also played a central role in the new order under the Sasanians. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian faith that had existed for centuries, became closely tied to state authority. Priests and religious institutions gained influence within the imperial administration. Sacred traditions were formalized, and religious identity became a pillar of imperial legitimacy. This alliance between throne and religion helped create a more unified ideological foundation for the empire, but it also introduced new tensions. Religious minorities, including Christians, Jews, and other communities, continued to live within Sasanian territory. Their presence required careful management, especially as Christianity began to spread rapidly within the neighboring Roman world. Religion, once a local matter in many communities, now intersected directly with imperial politics. The Sasanian Empire expanded quickly during its early decades. Ardashir and his successors moved to reclaim territories that had slipped away during the final centuries of Parthian rule. Regions across the Iranian plateau, Mesopotamia, and parts of Central Asia came firmly under Sasanian control, yet the greatest challenge lay to the west. There, the Roman Empire had evolved into a new political form often referred to as the Byzantine Empire, centered in the eastern Mediterranean city of Constantinople. The frontier between these two great powers stretched across the fertile lands of Mesopotamia and the mountain corridors of Armenia. Control of these regions meant access to trade, taxation, and strategic security for both empires. Retreat was not a viable option. Conflict became almost inevitable. The wars between the Sasanian Empire and the Byzantine Empire would last for centuries, forming one of the longest continuous rivalries in ancient history. These wars were rarely about total conquest. Instead, they focused on strategic cities, border fortresses, and influence over smaller buffer states such as Armenia. Armies marched across the same landscapes again and again. Cities were captured, lost, and captured again. The frontier never remained stable for long. One of the most powerful Sasanian rulers emerged in the late 3rd century CE. His name was Shapur I. During his reign, the Sasanian Empire demonstrated just how formidable it could be. In 260 CE, during one of the many conflicts with Rome, Shapur's forces achieved a stunning victory. The Roman Emperor Valerian himself was captured in battle. No Roman emperor had ever been taken prisoner by a foreign power before. The event sent shockwaves through the Roman world. It confirmed that the Sasanians were not merely another regional kingdom, they were a superpower. Across the following centuries, the Sasanian state continued to develop a complex administrative structure. Provinces were governed by officials appointed by the central authority. Roads and communication networks linked distant regions of the empire. Trade flourished. The empire sat at the crossroads of Eurasian commerce. Caravans carrying silk from China, spices from India, and luxury goods from across Asia moved through Sasanian-controlled territories toward the Mediterranean. Market cities such as Ctesiphon, the imperial capital near the Tigris River, grew into centers of wealth and political power. At its height, the Sasanian Empire rivaled Byzantium not only militarily but economically and culturally. Yet constant warfare with Byzantium carried enormous costs. Large armies had to be maintained along the frontier. Fortifications were built and rebuilt. Campaigns stretched supply lines across deserts and mountain passes. These wars rarely ended decisively. Instead, they created a cycle. Victory would shift the frontier slightly. Peace treaties would follow, then new conflicts would erupt as both empires sought advantage for centuries. This balance endured, but in the early 7th century CE, the balance finally broke. A new Sasanian ruler named Khosrow II, who came to power in 590 CE, launched one of the most ambitious campaigns in Persian history. Taking advantage of political turmoil within the Byzantine Empire, he initiated a massive offensive westward. The results were dramatic. By 614 CE, Sasanian forces had captured Jerusalem. By 619 CE, they had taken control of Egypt, the breadbasket of the Byzantine world. At the height of this expansion, the Sasanian Empire controlled territories stretching from Central Asia to the eastern Mediterranean. For a moment, it appeared that Persia might achieve what had eluded both the Parthians and earlier kings: total dominance over the Near East. But the success did not last. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius reorganized his forces and launched a daring counteroffensive. Beginning in 622 CE, instead of defending passively, Byzantine armies struck deep into Sasanian territory. Years of exhausting warfare followed. Both empires poured enormous resources into the struggle. Armies marched through devastated provinces. Cities were looted. Agricultural lands were damaged. By 628 CE, the Sasanian state had reached a breaking point. Internal revolts erupted. Khosrow II was overthrown and killed. A series of short-lived rulers followed, each struggling to maintain control over a war-weary empire. The long conflict with Byzantium had drained both sides, and in the south, a new force was rising that neither empire fully understood. In the Arabian Peninsula, a new religious movement had begun. In the early 7th century CE, its followers carried a message that would soon transform the political and spiritual landscape of the region: Islam. Within a few years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE, Arab armies united under the banner of the new faith began expanding outward from Arabia. At first, the great empires to the north underestimated them, but both the Byzantine and Sasanian states had been weakened by decades of war. Their armies were exhausted, their economies strained, their political systems unstable. The frontier defenses that once seemed impenetrable had become vulnerable. Arab forces advanced rapidly. In 636 CE, Sasanian armies suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. The imperial capital Ctesiphon soon fell. Further defeats followed. By 651 CE, the last Sasanian ruler, Yazdijir III, was killed while fleeing eastward. The Sasanian Empire collapsed with its fall in 651 CE. The final great pre-Islamic Persian state disappeared, but the consequences of its existence would endure far beyond its destruction. The Sasanians had revived the idea of a powerful centralized Persian monarchy. They had preserved and strengthened Iranian cultural traditions. They had shaped the political geography of the Near East. Through centuries of rivalry with Rome and Byzantium, even in defeat, those structures influenced the new Islamic empires that emerged afterward. Administrative practices, court rituals, taxation systems, and cultural traditions developed under the Sasanians would continue to shape governance across the Islamic world. The empire had fallen, but its legacy remained embedded in the region's institutions and identity. For nearly 400 years, the Sasanian Empire had stood as one of the great powers of Eurasia. Its rise had restored Persian authority after centuries of fragmentation. Its wars had exhausted two civilizations, and its collapse opened the door to a transformation that would reshape the entire Middle East. The world that followed would no longer be defined by Zoroastrian kings ruling from Persian capitals. A new era had begun, and the land once ruled by the Sasanian kings was about to enter one of the most profound transformations in its long history. The fall of the Sasanian Empire in 651 CE marked one of the most profound turning points in the long history of Iran. For more than 4 centuries, the Sasanian kings had ruled a powerful state that stood as the last great pre-Islamic Persian empire. Their authority had stretched across the Iranian plateau, through Mesopotamia, and into the frontier zones that bordered the Byzantine world. They had commanded vast armies, they had governed ancient cities, they had preserved the traditions of Persian kingship and the religion of Zoroastrianism, but by the middle of the 7th century, the system that once sustained this empire had begun to collapse under its own weight. The final decades of Sasanian rule had been consumed by war for more than 20 years. Beginning in 602 CE, the Sasanian and Byzantine empires fought one of the most destructive conflicts the ancient Near East had ever experienced. Armies marched repeatedly across the same territories: Syria, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Cities were captured and recaptured, farmlands were damaged, trade networks were disrupted. For a brief moment, the Persian king Khosrow II seemed to achieve victory. By 619 CE, Sasanian armies had conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. The empire reached further west than it had in centuries, but the success proved temporary. The Byzantine emperor Heraclius launched a dramatic counteroffensive beginning in 622 CE. Instead of defending the empire's borders, he carried the war deep into Persian territory. Over several exhausting campaigns, Byzantine forces struck at the heart of the Sasanian state. By 628 CE, the strain had become unbearable. Khosrow II was overthrown by his own nobles. The empire entered a period of chaos. Several rulers claimed the throne in quick succession. Some reigned only months before being removed or killed. Regional governors began acting independently, uncertain which authority they were meant to obey. The political center had fractured. The wars with Byzantium had drained the treasury, weakened the army, and destroyed the sense of stability that once held the empire together. What remained was a state exhausted by decades of conflict. At that very moment, far to the south, events were unfolding that would soon reshape the entire region. In the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, a new religious movement had begun to unite the previously divided Arab tribes. In the early 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad had preached a message centered on monotheism, social justice, and the worship of a single God, Allah. The new faith, Islam, spread rapidly across Arabia. Before this moment, the Arab tribes had rarely acted as a unified political force. Their loyalties were local and tribal, but Islam created a powerful new identity that transcended those divisions. By the time of Muhammad's death in 632 CE, much of Arabia had come under the leadership of a new political and religious community known as the Ummah. The leaders who followed Muhammad, known as caliphs, inherited both religious authority and political responsibility. Their state soon became known as the Rashidun Caliphate. At first, their primary concern was securing control over Arabia itself, but once the peninsula was unified, the new leadership faced an important question: what would come next? Arabia's economy had always depended partly on trade routes linking the Mediterranean world with the Indian Ocean, but the great empires to the north, the Byzantines and the Sasanians, had long controlled these networks. Their wars had also disrupted commerce across the region. The new Islamic State possessed something both of these older empires lacked: momentum. Arab tribes now fought under a shared banner. Their armies were mobile, disciplined, and motivated by both faith and opportunity. The nearby territories of the Byzantine and Sasanian empires were wealthy but politically fragile. Expansion began almost immediately. Arab forces first pushed north into Byzantine-controlled lands in Syria and Palestine. At the same time, other armies moved eastward toward the weakened Sasanian frontier. The initial encounters between Arab and Persian forces took place in 633 CE, along the borderlands of Iraq. These were not yet massive campaigns. They were probing advances, testing the strength of Sasanian defenses, but it quickly became clear that the once formidable Persian army no longer possessed the cohesion it once had. The decisive confrontation came in 636 CE at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. The Sasanian forces still possessed experienced commanders and war elephants, an intimidating weapon on the battlefield, but the army they fielded represented a state already weakened by years of internal conflict. Arab commanders relied on mobility and coordination between tribal units. Their forces moved quickly across open terrain and maintained strong morale. After several days of fighting, the Persian army collapsed. The defeat at Al-Qadisiyah in 636 CE opened the road to the imperial capital. Soon afterward, Arab forces captured Ctesiphon, the great Sasanian capital on the Tigris River. The fall of this city was not merely a military loss, it was a symbolic collapse of the imperial order. The royal court fled eastward. The last Sasanian king, Yazdijerd III, attempted to regroup his forces deeper within the Iranian plateau. For several years he moved from city to city, seeking allies among regional leaders, but the empire he hoped to restore no longer existed. Many provincial governors, recognizing the new balance of power, chose negotiation rather than continued resistance. Some towns surrendered peacefully, others fought brief battles before falling. The final collapse came in 651 CE, when Yazdijerd III was killed while fleeing towards Central Asia. With his death, the Sasanian Empire officially ended. The Arab armies had conquered Persia, but conquest alone does not explain what followed. The territories that had once belonged to the Sasanians were vast, culturally complex, and economically important. Integrating them into the new Islamic State required careful adaptation. The early caliphs did not attempt to destroy the existing administrative structures of Persia. Instead, They relied heavily on the systems already in place. Persian officials often continued to manage taxation and governance under new Islamic authorities. This approach was practical. Arab forces were relatively small compared to the populations they now ruled. Attempting to replace every administrator would have been impossible. Instead, the caliphate governed through cooperation with local elites over time. This arrangement created a new cultural synthesis. The Rashidun Caliphate, which ruled from 632 to 661 CE, oversaw the initial phase of expansion. Its leaders focused on stabilizing the newly conquered territories and maintaining unity among the rapidly growing Muslim community. But as the Islamic State expanded, political pressures increased. In 661 CE, after a period of internal conflict known as the First Fitna, power passed to a new dynasty, the Umayyad Caliphate. The Umayyads ruled from the city of Damascus. Their empire stretched from Spain in the west to Central Asia in the east. Persia now formed one of the central regions of this enormous state. At first, the Umayyad administration favored Arab elites within the imperial hierarchy. Persian populations often paid additional taxes as non-Arab subjects. Yet over time, Persian influence began to grow. The Iranian plateau had long been home to sophisticated administrative traditions, advanced agriculture, and vibrant cultural life. Persian scholars, merchants, and officials gradually became indispensable within the expanding Islamic world. The most dramatic transformation occurred with the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate in 750 CE. The Abbasids came to power partly through support from Persian regions that had grown dissatisfied with Umayyad rule. When the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads, they shifted the center of the Islamic world eastward. Their new capital, Baghdad, was founded near the old Sasanian center of Ctesiphon. This location was not accidental. Baghdad stood at the crossroads of the Iranian plateau, Mesopotamia, and the wider Islamic world. Persian administrators, scholars, and artisans played a major role in shaping the culture of the Abbasid court during the early centuries of Abbasid rule. From 750 CE to roughly 1000 CE, Persian intellectual and cultural traditions flourished within the Islamic framework. Scholars translated ancient Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy developed rapidly. Many of the scientists and thinkers who contributed to this intellectual flowering came from Persian backgrounds. Persian literary traditions also experienced a revival. The Persian language, which had existed in earlier forms for centuries, began to re-emerge as a major literary language under Islamic rule. Poets and historians preserved memories of the ancient Persian past, linking the new Islamic civilization with the region's earlier heritage. This blending of traditions created something new. Islam provided the religious and political framework of the empire. Persian culture contributed administrative skill, artistic expression, and intellectual depth. Together, they formed a civilization that stretched across continents. Yet the transformation carried permanent consequences. The fall of the Sasanian Empire ended the last great Zoroastrian monarchy of Persia. Over time, many Persian communities gradually adopted Islam. Although Zoroastrian populations continued to exist in smaller numbers, the religious landscape of Iran changed permanently. The political structure also shifted. Instead of a single Persian empire ruled by kings claiming divine authority, the region now belonged to a broader Islamic world governed by caliphs and regional dynasties. Persia did not disappear, but it was no longer the center of its own empire. And yet something remarkable happened in the centuries that followed. Rather than losing its identity, Persian culture reshaped the civilization that had conquered it. Administrative systems, court traditions, literature, architecture, and philosophical ideas drawn from Persian heritage spread throughout the Islamic world. In many ways, the conquerors were transformed by the lands they had conquered. By 1000 CE, the Iranian plateau had become one of the most influential cultural regions of the Islamic world. Persian scholars advised caliphs. Persian poets shaped literature. Persian cities thrived as centers of trade and learning. The empire of the Sasanians had vanished in 651 CE, but the civilization of Persia endured. It adapted to new rulers, new religions, and new political systems, and through that adaptation, it continued to shape the course of history across the Middle East and beyond. The conquest had ended one era, but it had also opened the door to another, because the centuries ahead would bring new dynasties, new invasions, and new struggles for power across the Iranian plateau. The story of Iran was far from finished. The centuries following the Islamic conquest of Persia had not erased the region's deep historical identity. By the beginning of the 11th century, the Iranian plateau had become one of the intellectual and cultural centers of the Islamic world. Persian scholars served in courts from Central Asia to Baghdad. Persian literature flourished. Cities across Iran remained connected to trade routes that carried goods between east and west, but politically, the region was no longer unified. The great caliphates that had once governed vast territories had begun to weaken. By the late 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled since 750 CE, still existed, but its authority had become largely symbolic. Real power had shifted to regional dynasties and military commanders who controlled provinces in the caliph's name across the Iranian plateau. Different rulers governed different territories in some regions. Persian dynasties such as the Samanids and Buyids held authority in others. Turkic military leaders had begun to rise within the armies of the Islamic world. These leaders had originally entered the region as soldiers, slaves, or mercenaries recruited from the steppes of Central Asia, but over time, they became rulers. This transformation was not unusual in the medieval world. Military power often created political authority, and the Turkic peoples who came from the vast grasslands of Central Asia possessed a long tradition of cavalry warfare, mobility, and discipline. They were well suited to the politics of the time. Among these rising Turkic powers, one group would soon reshape the entire political landscape of Iran. They were the Seljuks. The Seljuks were originally a branch of the Oghuz Turks, nomadic tribes who had migrated westward across the Central Asian steppe. Like many steppe peoples, their society was organized around clans and tribal leadership rather than large urban states, but the frontier between the steppe and the Islamic world had always been a zone of exchange and transformation. By the early 11th century, many Turkic groups had converted to Islam, and their leaders had begun participating in the politics of the Muslim world. The Seljuk leader who first brought his people into prominence was Tughril. Begin the 1030s and 1040s, Tughril and his followers began moving into the Iranian plateau, initially as allies and mercenaries in the conflicts between existing regional powers, but as the Seljuks gained strength, they began claiming territory for themselves. Their mobility and military organization allowed them to defeat several established dynasties that had ruled parts of Iran. The decisive moment came in 1055 CE, when Tughril entered the city of Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliph, who still held religious authority but little political power, formally recognized Tughril as Sultan, a title that acknowledged his role as protector of the Islamic world. This moment symbolized a major shift. The Seljuks had become the dominant political force across much of the Middle East and Iran. The Seljuk Empire, which expanded rapidly during the late 11th century, controlled territories stretching from Central Asia through Iran and into Anatolia under rulers such as Alp Arslan and Malik Shah. The empire reached its greatest strength. The Seljuk system differed from earlier Persian empires in important ways. The Sultan held supreme military authority, but administration often relied heavily on Persian bureaucrats and scholars. Persian culture continued to shape court life, literature, and governance. The Persian language remained the language of administration and intellectual life across many regions of the empire. This blending of Turkic military leadership with Persian administrative traditions created a powerful political system. One of the most famous administrators of the Seljuk state was Nizam al-Mulk, a Persian scholar and statesman who served as vizier to several Seljuk sultans. His writings on governance emphasized stability, justice, and careful management of provincial authorities under Seljuk rule. The Iranian plateau once again became part of a large, relatively unified political structure. Trade flourished, cities expanded, caravan routes linking China, India, and the Mediterranean continued to pass through Iranian lands. But stability in medieval empires was rarely permanent. After the death of Malik Shah in 1092 CE, the Seljuk Empire began to fragment. Rival claimants to the throne fought for power. Regional governors declared independence. Provinces once governed under a unified system gradually became separate states. This fragmentation did not immediately destroy the region's prosperity, but it weakened the political defenses that had once protected it. And beyond the eastern frontiers, a new power was rising in the vast grasslands of Mongolia. Far beyond the Iranian plateau, tribal societies had long competed for survival across the harsh environment of the steppe life. There required resilience, mobility, and strong leadership. In the late 12th century, a man named Temujin began uniting these tribes through alliances, battles, and careful political strategy. Temujin gradually brought together the rival clans of the Mongolian steppe. In 1206, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. What followed would become one of the most dramatic expansions of power in world history. The Mongol Empire grew with astonishing speed. Mongol armies, composed largely of highly disciplined cavalry units, moved rapidly across vast distances. Their tactics combined speed, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and devastating attacks on cities that resisted them. At first, their campaigns were directed eastward toward China, but events soon brought them westward. In the early 13th century, the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful state that controlled much of Iran and Central Asia, ruled the lands between the Mongols and the Middle East. Relations between the Khwarezmian ruler and Genghis Khan began cautiously, with trade and diplomacy. But a series of incidents, particularly the killing of Mongol envoys, triggered a crisis. Genghis Khan interpreted the actions as an unforgivable insult. In 1219 CE, the Mongol armies launched a massive invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. What followed was catastrophic. City after city fell to the Mongol advance. Bokhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, and other major urban centers were captured after brutal sieges. In many cases, populations were massacred and entire cities were destroyed. The Iranian plateau, which had once been a center of scholarship and commerce, now faced devastation on a scale rarely seen before. The Mongol strategy was clear: cities that surrendered peacefully might be spared, those that resisted were punished with overwhelming force. The destruction served as a warning to others. Word of these events spread rapidly. Some cities opened their gates immediately when Mongol armies approached, others attempted resistance and paid a terrible price. Agricultural lands were destroyed, irrigation systems that had supported farming for centuries were damaged or abandoned, trade routes collapsed as merchants fled war zones. The consequences were enormous. By the mid-13th century, much of Iran had been transformed from a network of thriving urban centers into a landscape marked by destruction and depopulation. After the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, the Mongol Empire continued expanding under his successors. In 1256 CE, a Mongol leader named Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, launched another major campaign into the Middle East. His forces captured the mountain strongholds of the Nizari Ismailis, including the famous fortress of Alamut. Then, in 1258 CE, Hulagu marched toward Baghdad. Baghdad had been the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate for 5 centuries. It was one of the greatest cities in the Islamic world, a center of learning, culture, and trade. The city fell after a brief siege. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 CE marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate's political authority. Libraries, schools, and markets were destroyed. The caliph himself was killed. For the Islamic world, the event symbolized the collapse of an era. The Mongols soon established a new ruling state over much of Iran known as the Ilkhanate, founded by Hulagu. At first, the Mongol rulers remained culturally distinct from the populations they governed, but over time, something remarkable occurred. Just as earlier conquerors had adapted to Persian culture, the Mongol rulers gradually adopted many aspects of the civilization they had conquered. Persian administrators returned to positions of influence. Persian language and tradition shaped the court. By the early 14th century, several Ilkhanid rulers had even converted to Islam. Despite this cultural adaptation, the damage caused by the invasions could not be easily reversed. Entire regions of the Iranian plateau had lost large portions of their population. Irrigation networks and agricultural systems required decades to rebuild. Trade routes had shifted as merchants sought safer paths. Even after stability returned under Mongol rule, the political unity of Iran remained fragile. The Ilkhanate itself began to weaken in the mid-14th century after the death of the Ilkhanid ruler Abu Sa'id in 1335 CE. The state fragmented into smaller competing kingdoms. Local dynasties and warlords fought for control of different regions. The Iranian plateau entered another period of political division. Then, in the late 14th century, another conqueror emerged from Central Asia. His name was Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. Timur claimed descent from the Mongol tradition and sought to restore a form of imperial authority across the lands once conquered by Genghis Khan. His armies launched campaigns across Central Asia, Persia, and parts of the Middle East. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Towers built from the skulls of defeated enemies became grim symbols of his campaigns. Yet Timur was not simply a destroyer, he also patronized architecture, scholarship, and trade in the cities he favored, especially his capital at Samarkand. Still, his conquests did not create a lasting unified empire in Iran. After Timur's death in 1405 CE, his territories again fragmented into competing states. By the late 15th century, the Iranian plateau was divided among several regional powers, including the Timurid successors, the Aq Koyunlu, and the Kara Koyunlu tribal confederations. For nearly 5 centuries, from 1000 to 1500 CE, Iran had experienced cycles of empire, fragmentation, invasion, and reconstruction. The Seljuks had created a powerful state that restored political unity. The Mongol invasions had shattered that stability. Timur's campaigns had briefly imposed order before leaving the region divided once again. Yet throughout these upheavals, one element endured: Persian culture survived despite the destruction of cities and the rise and fall of dynasties. Persian language, literature, and intellectual traditions continued shaping the societies that ruled the plateau. By the end of the 15th century, the stage was set for another transformation. A new dynasty would soon rise from the chaos of fragmented kingdoms. It would reunify much of Iran under a single authority, and in doing so, it would define a new identity that continues to shape the nation even today. The next chapter would begin with the rise of the Safavid Empire, and with it, the creation of a distinctly Shura Iranian state. History sometimes moves slowly, like a river carving its path through stone. Empires rise gradually, cultures evolve over centuries, and borders shift almost unnoticed. But sometimes history changes in a single generation, and when it does, entire civilizations are reborn. At the dawn of the 16th century, the land we now call Iran stood at one of those turning points. For nearly 500 years, Since the collapse of the Sasanian Empire in 651 CE, Persia had been ruled by foreign dynasties. Fragmented kingdoms, and competing warlords Turks, Mongols, and tribal confederations had risen and fallen across the Iranian plateau. Cities had been destroyed and rebuilt, empires had come and gone, but one thing had never returned: a unified Persian state. The Iranian plateau remained divided among rival powers like the Achaemenid and Karakoyanlu, Turkic tribal confederations whose authority stretched across parts of Anatolia, Iraq, and western Iran. Power belonged not to a centralized monarchy, but to shifting tribal alliances. The political structure was unstable, and instability invites revolution. From the mountainous region of Ardabil, in northwestern Iran, a movement was growing that would change the entire destiny of the region. At first, it was not a political movement at all, it was a religious order. This group was known as the Safaviya, a Sufi brotherhood founded centuries earlier by a mystic named Sheikh Safi al-Din in the 14th century. Originally, the Safaviya had been a spiritual community devoted to mystical Islam. Its followers sought closeness to God through devotion, discipline, and loyalty to their spiritual leader. But over generations, something extraordinary happened. The order began transforming from a religious movement into a militant force. Its followers developed intense devotion to their leader, whom they viewed not merely as a teacher but as a divinely guided figure. Many of these followers came from Turkic tribes across Anatolia and the Caucasus. They were known as the Kizilbash, meaning redheads, because of the distinctive red caps they wore. Their loyalty was absolute and their numbers were growing. By the end of the 15th century, the Safavid order had become far more than a religious brotherhood, it had become a revolutionary army. At the center of this transformation stood a young leader who would reshape Persian history. His name was Ismail. Ismail Safavi was born in 1487, the son of the Safavid leader Sheikh Haidar, but his childhood was shaped by violence and political struggle. His father had been killed in battle, his family had been persecuted by rival powers for years. Ismail lived in hiding, but legends grew around him among his followers. He was believed to possess divine favor, even supernatural power. Stories spread that he could not be defeated in battle. By the age of 14, Ismail decided it was time to reclaim his destiny. In 1499, he emerged from hiding and gathered his Kizilbash followers. Within just a few years, this teenage leader would overthrow the powers that controlled Iran. The speed of his rise stunned the region. In 1501, after defeating the Achaemenid forces near the city of Tabriz, Ismail marched triumphantly into the city. There, he made a declaration that would permanently change the identity of Iran. He crowned himself Shah of Iran for the first time in centuries. A unified Persian monarchy had returned, but Ismail did something even more revolutionary. He declared Twelver Shia Islam the official state religion of his new empire. This decision was not merely religious, it was political, and it would reshape the Middle East forever. At the time, the majority of Muslims across the Islamic world were Sunni. The great empires surrounding Iran, especially the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Uzbek states to the northeast, followed Sunni Islam. By declaring Shia Islam as the official faith, Ismail created a distinct religious identity for his state. Iran would no longer simply be another Muslim kingdom, it would become the center of Shia Islam. This decision unified the country under a powerful ideological foundation, but it also triggered fierce resistance. Many parts of Iran were still predominantly Sunni. To enforce religious unity, the Safavid state launched a massive campaign of religious transformation. Sunni institutions were replaced. Shia scholars were invited from regions like Lebanon and Iraq to establish new religious schools. Over time, the population gradually adopted the new religious identity. The consequences were enormous. This moment, 1501 CE, marked the beginning of the modern Iranian religious identity that still exists today. But Ismail's revolution also created powerful enemies. The Ottoman Empire, one of the strongest states in the world, saw the rise of a militant Shia empire on its eastern border as a dangerous threat. Tensions quickly escalated. In 1514, these tensions exploded into war at the Battle of Calderon. The Ottoman army, equipped with powerful artillery and firearms, confronted Ismail's forces. Despite their courage and loyalty, the Kizilbash cavalry could not overcome the Ottomans' technological advantage. Ismail suffered a devastating defeat. The battle shattered the myth of his invincibility. Ottoman forces temporarily captured Tabriz, and the Safavid Empire lost parts of western territory. But the defeat did not destroy the Safavid state. Instead, it forced it to evolve. Over the following decades, Safavid rulers strengthened their military and administrative systems. They reduced reliance on tribal forces and began building a more centralized state. This transformation reached its greatest height under one of the most remarkable rulers in Iranian history, Shah Abbas I. When Shah Abbas I came to power in 1588, the Safavid Empire was in trouble. Internal rivalries weakened the state. Ottoman and Uzbek enemies threatened its borders. Tribal Kizilbash leaders held too much power. Abbas understood that survival required reform. He began restructuring the empire from the ground up. First, he reorganized the Military. Instead of relying solely on tribal cavalry, he created a new standing army composed of soldiers loyal directly to the Shah. These troops included ghulams, soldiers recruited from the Caucasus and trained as professional warriors. This reduced the influence of tribal warlords. Next, Abbas strengthened central authority. Provincial governors were replaced with officials loyal to the crown. Tax systems were reorganized. Infrastructure projects improved roads and trade routes. But Shah Abbas did something even more visionary. He turned Iran into a global commercial power. In 1598, he moved the Safavid capital to the city of Isfahan, and then he transformed it. Isfahan became one of the most magnificent cities in the world. Grand boulevards, monumental mosques, royal palaces, and enormous public squares were built. At the center stood Nakshi Jahan Square, one of the largest urban plazas ever constructed. European travelers who visited Isfahan described it as one of the most beautiful cities they had ever seen. The city became a hub of trade connecting Europe, India, Central Asia, and China. Silk production flourished. Caravans traveled across the empire carrying goods between continents. Under Shah Abbas, the Safavid Empire entered its golden age. The military recovered lost territories, trade expanded, art, architecture, and scholarship flourished. For the first time in centuries, Iran stood once again as a powerful and unified civilization. But like many empires, the Safavid state contained hidden weaknesses. After Shah Abbas died in 1629, later rulers lacked his strength and vision. Court intrigues grew, corruption spread through the administration, military discipline weakened. By the early 18th century, the once powerful empire had become fragile. Then, in 1722, disaster struck. Afghan tribal forces led by Mahmud Hotak invaded eastern Iran. Safavid armies, weakened by years of decline, failed to stop them. The Afghans marched toward Isfahan, the heart of the empire. After a long siege, the magnificent capital finally surrendered. The fall of Isfahan in 1722 shocked the entire region. The Safavid Empire, once the power that had reshaped Iran, had collapsed for more than 2 centuries. From 1501 to 1736, the Safavids had transformed Persia. They restored political unity. They established Shia Islam as the defining faith of the nation. They created a centralized monarchy and a cultural renaissance. But their greatest legacy was something deeper. They created the foundations of modern Iran. Before the Safavids, Persia had been a geographic region with shifting rulers. After the Safavids, Iran had become a distinct political and religious civilization, a state with its own identity, an identity that continues to shape the country even today. Yet history never stops. Out of the chaos following the Safavid collapse, another powerful figure would rise, a warrior who would reunify the country once more. His name was Nader Shah, and his story would mark the beginning of another dramatic chapter in Iran's long and turbulent history. History often remembers empires for their longevity, for the slow accumulation of culture, institutions, and territory, but occasionally, history is defined by a single figure, a force of nature whose ambition and skill temporarily reshaped the world around them. In Iran, the 18th century would produce one such figure, Nader Shah, the last great conqueror to transform Persia into a dominant military power. The Safavid Empire, once a shining center of culture, religion, and commerce, had by the early 1730s fallen into disarray. Years of internal decay, weak rulers, and external threats had left the Iranian plateau fragmented and vulnerable. Cities were depopulated, agricultural networks disrupted, and the centralized state that had defined the Safavid era had collapsed almost entirely. The Afghans had overrun Isfahan in 1722, leaving the capital shattered and the Safavid dynasty teetering on the brink of extinction. The power vacuum invited chaos. Tribal confederacies, local warlords, and foreign powers all sought to carve out their own spheres of influence. Amid this turmoil emerged Nader Qoli Beg, later known as Nader Shah, born in 1698 in the region of Khorasan. He was a man shaped by the hardships of his time, the constant wars, the collapse of authority, and the lawlessness of the eastern frontier forged in him a discipline, resilience, and ruthlessness that would define his life. Nader was neither Safavid nor Ottoman by heritage. He was Afshar, a Turkic tribal warrior, and he understood that survival in this chaotic world required not just courage, but unyielding strategy. By the 1720s, as the Safavids crumbled, Nader emerged as a military leader capable of imposing order where others could not. His initial campaigns were defensive, focused on driving the Afghans from the Iranian heartland. He combined meticulous planning with aggressive battlefield tactics, leveraging mobility, precise timing, and disciplined infantry formations. By 1729, Nader had decisively defeated the Afghan forces and restored a semblance of Safavid authority under the puppet Shah Tahmasp II, effectively placing himself at the center of power. This moment of restoration, however, was temporary. Nader quickly recognized that the survival of Iran required more than merely ousting invaders. It required the creation of a strong centralized state and a powerful military that could dominate the region. By 1736, Nader deposed Tahmasp II, not out of ambition alone but because weak monarchs had repeatedly allowed Iran to fragment and fall prey to enemies. He crowned himself Shah of Iran, founding the Achaemenid dynasty, and signaled a new era. Nader Shah was not a typical ruler. He combined the authority of a monarch with the strategic mind of a general, and he ruled with an iron discipline that allowed him to achieve what had been impossible for decades: the reunification of Iran. The army he commanded was formidable. It integrated tribal cavalry with modernized infantry, artillery, and siege tactics learned from both Ottoman and European models. His military campaigns, swift and often brutal, reflected the precariousness of the Iranian state. There was no room for delay or failure. His first major campaign beyond Iran was against the Ottoman Empire in the west. The Ottomans had long contested Iranian territory, claiming regions in Mesopotamia and the Caucasus. Between 1730 and 1736, Nader led repeated invasions into Ottoman-held lands, reclaiming disputed cities and fortresses. These campaigns were more than displays of personal ambition, they were a strategic necessity. A weak West would have allowed Ottoman incursions into the Iranian heartland. Through relentless pressure and decisive victories, Nader secured Iran's western borders and projected power in a way the Safavids had never managed. But Nader Shah's ambitions extended far beyond mere defense. In 1738, he turned eastward, focusing on the Mongol Empire in India, one of the richest states in the world at the time. This campaign was unprecedented in scale and audacity. Nader's army, numbering perhaps 55,000 men, marched across deserts, rivers, and mountains, maintaining strict discipline and supply lines in a region where logistical failure could easily destroy an invading force. By the end of 1739, Nader Shah captured Delhi, the Mongol capital. The city was looted systematically, treasures including the fabled peacock throne and enormous amounts of gold and silver were taken back to Iran. The invasion of India served multiple purposes. Economically, it filled the Iranian treasury, providing resources to rebuild cities, maintain armies, and stabilize governance. Politically, it projected power far beyond the traditional boundaries of Persia, announcing to both East and West that Iran had returned as a dominant force. Strategically, it created a buffer zone. The wealth of India could now support Iranian military power, ensuring that future rivals could not easily challenge the central authority. Yet the brilliance of Nader Shah's campaigns came at a cost. His conquests were relentless and often catastrophic for civilian populations. Cities were destroyed or depopulated, agricultural production in invaded regions suffered long-term disruption, trade networks in India and the Iranian plateau were destabilized temporarily, causing famine and displacement. The social fabric of many regions under his campaigns was irrevocably altered, even within Iran. Nader's rule was marked by harsh discipline. Dissent was punished brutally, often with execution or exile. While this ensured control, it sowed resentment that would later destabilize the Achaemenid dynasty after his death. The permanent effects of Nader Shah's rule were profound. For the first time since the Safavid collapse, Iran was politically reunified, militarily strong, and recognized as a regional power capable of projecting influence across continents. He demonstrated that centralized authority, combined with disciplined military organization and strategic vision, could overcome centuries of fragmentation. At the same time, his campaigns revealed the fragility of such a system. It depended entirely on the strength and personality of the ruler. Without Nader Shah, the Achaemenid Empire lacked the institutional depth to survive long-term. By the 1740s, Nader had expanded Iranian influence across the Caucasus, into Mesopotamia, and parts of Central Asia. Yet as he aged, his rule grew increasingly despotic and erratic. Paranoia and cruelty alienated key generals and administrators. Revolts erupted across the empire, from tribal uprisings to rebellions in cities that once welcomed his authority. The very methods that had built the empire, military discipline, centralized authority, personal loyalty, became unsustainable without his presence. In 1747, Nader Shah was assassinated by his own guards. His death unleashed chaos. The Achaemenid dynasty fragmented almost immediately. Regional governors, tribal leaders, and local warlords seized control over provinces. The empire he had built in a generation collapsed as quickly as it had risen. For decades, Iran would remain politically fractured until the rise of the Qajar dynasty at the end of the 18th century. Yet despite its short-lived nature, Nader Shah's era had permanent consequences. He demonstrated that Iran could again be a military and political powerhouse, capable of projecting influence across the region. He re-established centralized authority, laying foundations that later rulers would attempt to revive. He expanded Iran's territorial ambitions and left a cultural imprint, bringing treasures, art, and intellectual influence From India back to the Persian heartland, most importantly, he created a national memory of power and resurgence, reminding Iranians that even after centuries of fragmentation and invasion, their civilization could assert itself on the world stage. Nader Shah was the last great conqueror of the Iranian plateau. His campaigns briefly restored Iran to the heights once held by the Achaemenids, the Sassanians, and the Safavids, but his achievements also revealed the limits of personal rule. Empires built on the strength of a single individual are fragile, and the human and social costs of conquest can echo for generations. By the end of the 18th century, Iran had returned to a pattern familiar in its long history: territorial fragmentation, political turbulence, and the search for a ruler capable of reunifying the land. The era of Nader Shah had ended, leaving behind both a memory of glory and a warning of the fragility of power. The story of Iran continued, its resilience shaped by cycles of conquest and revival, its identity strengthened by the lessons of both triumph and disaster. The plateau of Persia had witnessed another dramatic chapter, but as always, history promised that the next upheaval would arrive, testing the endurance and ingenuity of this ancient civilization once again. When Nader Shah died in 1747, the Iranian plateau once again fell into chaos. The Achaemenid Empire, built in a single lifetime through military genius, dissolved almost immediately. Iran, with its long history of empire and civilization, had once more returned to political fragmentation. Over the next decades, regional warlords, tribal confederations, and local dynasties struggled for supremacy, but none could recreate the centralized power that had defined previous eras. Into this vacuum rose the Qajar tribe, a Turkic people from northern Iran, who would establish a new dynasty in 1796. Their founder, Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar, was a man of ruthless ambition and iron will. He understood that Iran's fractured politics required a combination of fear, loyalty, and relentless military discipline to maintain authority. By defeating rival factions and consolidating control over the Iranian heartland, he declared himself Shah of Iran, founding the Qajar dynasty and establishing Tehran as the new capital. At first glance, the Qajar era promised continuity and stability, but the reality of the late 18th and 19th centuries was far more complex. Unlike the powerful empires of the Safavids or Nader Shah's Afsharids, the Qajars inherited a landscape profoundly changed by history. Decades of invasions, internal strife, and administrative neglect had weakened Iran's economy, depopulated cities, and fractured social cohesion. The state lacked the resources to maintain strong military forces, and provincial governors often acted with near-total autonomy. This structural weakness left Iran vulnerable to a new kind of threat: foreign imperialism. By the early 19th century, two powers were poised to exploit the country's instability: Russia to the north and Britain to the south. Russia, emerging from the turmoil of its own expansionist wars, sought access to the Caspian and Caucasian regions. Britain focused on securing trade routes to India and protecting colonial interests. Southern Iran and the Persian Gulf. Both empires saw a weak Iran not as a threat, but as an opportunity. The first major crises came with the Russo-Persian Wars. Beginning in 1804, Russia sought to expand its territories southward into the Caucasus, targeting regions that Iran had historically claimed. The Qajar armies, poorly equipped and poorly organized, were repeatedly defeated. Cities fell, fortresses were captured, and Iranian sovereignty in the north gradually eroded. By 1828, the war concluded with the Treaty of Turkmenchay, forcing Iran to cede vast territories in the Caucasus, including modern-day Armenia, Azerbaijan, and parts of Georgia. The treaty not only humiliated the Qajar monarchy but also marked a permanent shift in the regional balance of power. Iran would no longer dominate the Caucasus. To the south, British influence grew through diplomacy, trade, and direct intervention in local affairs. The Qajar state, economically weakened by decades of warfare and the loss of northern territories, increasingly relied on foreign loans and advisors. These financial arrangements came with strings attached: concessions to British firms, rights to Iranian ports, and influence over fiscal policy. By the mid-19th century, Iran's autonomy was heavily constrained. The once powerful Iranian monarchy now functioned as a semi-dependent client state under the shadow of imperial powers. Internally, the Qajars faced mounting challenges. The Iranian economy struggled under the weight of foreign-imposed treaties, heavy taxation, and mismanagement. Agricultural productivity, already weakened by centuries of neglect, could not meet the needs of a growing population. Local markets suffered as foreign goods flooded urban centers. Corruption and inefficiency within the administration exacerbated inequality, leading to social unrest. By the late 19th century, a combination of economic distress, political weakness, and foreign domination created fertile ground for reform. Movements. The response to these pressures took the form of the Constitutional Revolution of 1906, a moment that would permanently alter Iranian politics. Reformers, intellectuals, merchants, and clerics demanded limits on royal authority, the creation of a representative assembly, and the establishment of laws that would protect citizens from arbitrary rule under immense pressure. Mozaffar al-Din Shah Qajar agreed to a constitution, creating the Majlis, Iran's parliament. The revolution marked a profound shift. For the first time in centuries, Iran attempted to move away from absolute monarchy toward constitutional governance. The changes were not immediate or complete. Struggles between the Shah and the Majlis continued for decades, but the principle of political accountability and civic representation became embedded in Iranian consciousness. The constitutional revolution also exposed a deeper reality. Iran's survival now depended not only on strong rulers but on the resilience of its institutions. Yet the period was not without tragedy. Foreign powers, unwilling to see a strong independent Iran, manipulated internal divisions. Russia and Britain intervened militarily and politically, undermining constitutional authority when it threatened their interests. Wars and rebellions continued, and the population suffered from instability, famine, and displacement. These decades left a legacy of skepticism toward foreign intervention and a heightened awareness of Iran's geopolitical vulnerability. Lessons that would echo well into the 20th century. By the early 1920s, the Qajar state was a fragile shell of its former self. Regional governors, tribal leaders, and foreign powers held as much, if not more, influence than the monarchy. Economic weakness, social unrest, and political fragmentation created the conditions for a new form of leadership to emerge. In 1925, the Qajar dynasty was formally replaced by the Pahlavi dynasty, a transition that reflected both the failures and the enduring legacy of the Qajars, a nation shaped by centuries of imperial interference, yet capable of reinvention. The Qajar era, spanning 1796 to 1925, was defined by contradiction. It was a period in which Iran was politically weak and economically constrained, yet culturally rich and socially dynamic. It was a time when foreign empires shaped the destiny of the Iranian state, yet Iranians fought to assert their autonomy and identity. It was an era of loss and humiliation, but also of awakening and reform. In retrospect, the period revealed truths that could not have unfolded differently. Iran's geographic position, at the crossroads of empires, made foreign intrusion almost inevitable. Once internal cohesion was lost, the fragmented political structure, inherited from centuries of dynastic collapse, left the monarchy dependent on external powers for survival. And yet, these very pressures forced Iranians to confront questions of governance, rights, and national identity that would define modern Iran. The permanent consequences of the Qajar era were profound territorial losses in the Caucasus, where irreversible economic dependence on foreign powers became a persistent feature of Iranian statecraft. At the same time, the constitutional revolution planted the seeds of civic engagement, legal accountability, and the notion of a citizenry with rights, a revolutionary idea that would resurface repeatedly throughout the 20th century. By the time the Qajar dynasty ended in 1925, Iran had emerged from centuries of fragmentation, invasion, and reform with a clearer sense of its political and national identity. The stage was set for modernization, centralization, and the further struggle to reconcile tradition with the pressures of a globalizing world. Yet the memory of foreign interference, economic dependency, and fragile authority would continue to shape the country's decisions, fears, and ambitions for generations to come. The age of imperial influence had left its mark. Iran had survived, but it had been changed forever. Its people had witnessed the limits of monarchy, the consequences of foreign power, and the potential for collective political action. The next chapter in Iran's history would confront these legacies directly, as the 20th century brought revolution, modernization, and new forms of struggle for sovereignty. History, in the 20th century, moved faster than ever before. The Iranian plateau, long accustomed to centuries-long dynastic cycles, would experience transformations in decades that previously had taken centuries. From the ashes of the Qajar dynasty in 1925, a new figure rose to unify and modernize Iran. Reza Shah Pahlavi. His reign marked the beginning of a tumultuous era in which Iran would struggle to reconcile tradition with modernity, sovereignty with foreign influence, and national identity with revolutionary change. Reza Shah emerged from obscurity. Born in 1878 in the northern province of Mazandaran, he came from humble beginnings, joining the military as a young man and rising through its ranks during the chaotic years following the Qajar collapse. By the early 1920s, Iran was fragmented politically and economically. Tribal unrest, local warlordism, and foreign influence from Britain and Russia had left the country weak and exposed. Reza Shah, leveraging his military Authority marched on Tehran in 1921 in a coup that established him as the dominant power behind the throne. By 1925, the Qajar dynasty was formally abolished, and Reza Shah crowned himself monarch, founding the Pahlavi dynasty. His rule was characterized by a relentless pursuit of modernization, centralization, and national unity. Roads, railways, schools, and factories reshaped the physical and social landscape of Iran. He introduced Western-style education, reformed the legal system, and curtailed the power of religious authorities. The country was transformed from a loosely connected collection of provinces into a modern nation-state with a centralized administration. Yet modernization came at a cost. Reza Shah ruled with authoritarian control. Tribal autonomy was crushed, political dissent was suppressed, and the monarchy increasingly relied on secret police and military enforcement. This period created a permanent tension in Iranian society. The benefits of development were inseparable from the experience of repression. By the 1930s, Iran was modernizing rapidly, yet much of the population, especially in rural areas, remained politically marginalized. World events soon pulled Iran into global struggles it could not entirely avoid. During World War II, Iran's strategic position, oil reserves, and transportation networks made it a critical corridor for Allied forces. Despite Reza Shah's declared neutrality, the British and Soviet armies invaded in 1941, deposing him in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. This occupation marked a turning point. Iran became a pawn in global geopolitics, its sovereignty constrained by external powers even as it pursued internal modernization. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, young and inexperienced, inherited a nation poised between tradition and transformation, independence and foreign influence. The post-war years were marked by political instability, economic challenges, and social unrest. Attempts at parliamentary governance were weak, and the Shah increasingly relied on patronage, military force, and alliances with foreign powers, particularly the United States and Britain, to maintain authority. The 1950s brought one of the most dramatic confrontations of modern Iranian history, the nationalization of oil under Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1951. For decades, foreign powers had exploited Iranian oil, primarily through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, leaving the country economically dependent and politically constrained. Mossadegh's nationalization challenged British economic dominance and threatened U.S. interests in the region. The international response was swift and severe. In 1953, a covert operation orchestrated by Britain's MI6 and the United States CIA, known as Operation Ajax, removed Mossadegh from power and restored the Shah's authority. This event had profound and permanent consequences. Iran's perception of foreign interference became a central theme in its political consciousness, sowing distrust toward Western powers and shaping nationalist sentiment for decades to come. The Shah then embarked on what would become known as the White Revolution, a series of ambitious modernization and reform programs launched in 1963. Land reform, industrial expansion, literacy campaigns, and infrastructure projects aimed to modernize society rapidly. Women were granted the right to vote, new schools and universities were built, and urban centers expanded with unprecedented speed. Yet modernization intensified social tensions. Rural populations, displaced by land reform, migrated to cities, creating overcrowding and unemployment. Traditional religious authorities, whose influence had been curtailed, resented the secularization and westernization of society. Political repression, exercised through the secret police SAVAK, stifled dissent. The growing disconnect between the Shah's vision and the realities of everyday life created an undercurrent of dissatisfaction that would eventually erupt. By the 1970s, Iran had become a nation of contradictions. Its economy was booming, driven by oil revenues, yet social inequality persisted. Its cities were modernizing, yet political freedoms were restricted. Its leadership projected power abroad, yet internally, citizens increasingly questioned the legitimacy of the monarchy. In 1978, this tension exploded into the Iranian Revolution. Mass protests, strikes, and demonstrations swept across the country, uniting secular intellectuals, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens in opposition to the Shah. The revolutionary movement was decentralized yet powerful, led symbolically by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who had long advocated for an Islamic governance system that would place religious authority above the monarchy. By February 1979, the Shah fled Iran, and the monarchy, a symbol of centuries of centralized authority, collapsed almost overnight. The revolution was not merely a change of rulers, it was a profound transformation of the state, society, and ideology. In April 1979, Iran declared itself an Islamic republic, establishing a new political system in which sovereignty resided in religious authority. The constitution combined elements of democracy with theocratic oversight, creating a unique system in which the supreme leader held ultimate authority over the president, parliament, and judiciary. This transformation had immediate and long-lasting consequences. Social policies shifted dramatically, enforcing religious laws, restricting Western cultural influences, and redefining gender roles. Political power became concentrated in clerical institutions, while secular parties and opposition movements were marginalized or banned internationally. Iran's relations with the United States and Western powers collapsed, while ties with regional movements, revolutionary states, and anti-imperialist causes expanded. The Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988 further shaped the nation, instigated by territorial disputes and regional insecurity. The conflict was devastating. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, infrastructure was destroyed, and economic resources were drained. Yet the war also solidified national identity around the new Islamic Republic, embedding the narrative of resistance and resilience into the Iranian consciousness. Following the war, Iran navigated the complexities of reconstruction, regional politics, and the pressures of globalization. Economic modernization efforts continued, particularly in oil and gas sectors, but international sanctions, political isolation, and internal factionalism created recurring challenges. By the early 21st century, Iran had established itself as a regional power, influential in the Middle East, yet constrained by both domestic dynamics and global geopolitics. As of 2026, Iran stands as a civilization shaped by millennia of empire, conquest, cultural achievement, and revolution. The Pahlavi modernization, the revolutionary transformation of 1979, and the ongoing evolution of the Islamic Republic reveal a nation continuously negotiating the tensions between sovereignty and foreign influence, modernity and tradition, central authority and popular will. The consequences of these struggles are profound. Iran's political system, social structures, and regional role cannot be understood without reference to the revolutions, reforms, and conflicts of the past century. In reflecting on this period, several truths emerge. Modern Iran's trajectory was shaped by forces beyond its control: foreign intervention, global economic shifts, and regional conflict. Yet it was also shaped by the choices of its leaders and its people, the pursuit of modernization, the embrace of religious governance, and the struggle for national independence. The transformation from monarchy to Islamic Republic could not have unfolded differently, given the deep social, economic, and political pressures accumulated over decades. The permanent changes were profound. The monarchy was replaced with a system rooted in religious authority. Iranian national identity became inseparable from both revolutionary ideology and historical consciousness, and the memory of foreign intervention and internal upheaval continues to shape Iranian domestic and foreign policy. Economically, socially, and politically, the nation was transformed in ways that continue to reverberate into the present day. The story of modern Iran, stretching from 1925 to 2026, is the story of a civilization that has endured, adapted, and redefined itself through monarchy, foreign pressure, revolution, and religious transformation. It is the story of resilience forged through centuries of challenge, the struggle to reconcile tradition with modernity, and the ongoing negotiation of power, identity, and sovereignty. And as the 21st century progresses, Iran continues to navigate this path, carrying forward lessons from its history while confronting the uncertain pressures of a changing world. Its story is unfinished, yet shaped irrevocably by the legacies of monarchy, revolution, and the creation of the Islamic Republic, a civilization that has survived for over 2,500 years, transformed again and again, yet remains unmistakably Iran. From the earliest days of Cyrus the Great, through the rise and fall of the Achaemenids, the brilliance of the Sasanians, the upheavals of the Islamic conquest, and the transformations of the modern era, Iran's history has been a testament to endurance. Civilizations rise, empires crumble, borders shift, and rulers pass into memory, but some nations endure, shaped by the lessons of their past. Iran has faced invasions, foreign domination, internal revolts, and revolutions, yet through every trial, its people and culture have persisted. The ancient streets of Persepolis echo in the modern avenues of Tehran. The struggles of tribal warriors, scholars, and revolutionaries are reflected in the hopes and challenges of today. History, with all its triumphs and tragedies, flows into the present, reminding us that every moment of power, conflict, or renewal leaves a mark on the identity of a nation. As we look across centuries, from mighty Persian kings to revolutionary leaders, from conquests to constitutional struggles, we see not only the story of Iran but a mirror of the human condition, the relentless drive to survive, to rebuild, and to endure. What was lost shaped what could be reclaimed, what was broken inspired what could be renewed. Thank you for joining this journey through time. If you found this story as captivating as I do, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring history to life, one story at a time, past picture. And as we reflect on Iran's journey, remember, the past is never truly gone. It lives within the land, the people, and the choices we make today.